In behavioral political economy, we can think about what fuels our bias in the political world. We can cover topics such as confirmation bias, availability bias, and overconfidence, as there is a vast literature in behavioral economics on these concepts. But here, we're going to focus on availability bias. How is it that availability bias impacts the way that we're systematically biased in political thinking? Wasati, what you see is all there is clearly related to this idea of availability bias. That the things that we see, the things that we can recall, the things that are available to our memory end up being given additional weight in terms of the probability of them actually happening. News coverage will impact availability bias. News coverage will make some areas of life seem more important than other areas. Violent crime will be reported and perceived as more likely because we can think of examples of it. Drug-related violent crime will be reported. Peaceful interactions will not be. An immigrant committing murder is more likely to be on a big news story than one of us killing one of us. And so we think that it's more likely to happen. We think of airplanes as being more dangerous than they actually are because we can recall when they have failed. The news coverage is 24/7 and everywhere when a plane falls from the sky. The invisible nature of the invisible hand makes anti-market bias obvious. All kinds of examples as to how policy could be biased by our irrationality being systematically skewed by availability bias exist. Right? Because we cannot easily recall examples, availability bias is going to downplay certain avenues. But because certain elements can be easily recalled, such as plane crashes, things like that, we will give more weight towards those ideas. Availability bias is everywhere. It's giving additional weight to events that are more easily recalled. Another example will take us further down understanding this phenomenon. This example comes from Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, Chapter 30, Rare Events. Quote, I visited Israel several times during a period in which suicide bombings in buses were relatively common, though of course quite rare in absolute terms. There were altogether 23 bombings between December 2001 and September 2004, which had caused a total of 236 fatalities. The number of daily bus riders in Israel was approximately 1.3 million at that time. For any traveler, the risks were tiny, but that was not how the public felt about it. People avoided buses as much as they could, and many travelers spent their time on the bus anxiously scanning their neighbors for packages or bulky clothes that might hide a bomb. I did not have much occasion to travel on buses, as I was driving a rented car, but I was chagrined to discover that my behavior was also affected. I found that I did not like to stop next to a bus at a red light, and I drove away more quickly than usual when the light changed. I was ashamed of myself because, of course, I knew better. I knew that the risk was truly negligible, and that in any effect at all on my actions would assign an inordinately high decision weight to that minuscule probability. In fact, I was more likely to be injured in a driving accident than by stopping near a bus. But my avoidance of buses was not motivated by a rational concern for survival. What drove me was the experience of the moment. Being next to a bus made me think of bombs, and these thoughts were unpleasant. I was avoiding buses because I wanted to think of something else. My experience illustrates how terrorism works and why it is so effective. It induces an availability cascade. Availability cascades are tightly tied to the idea of availability bias. Within an availability cascade, the idea is that you get this self-sustaining chain of events, right? It's this self-reinforcing process of collective belief formation by which an expressed perception triggers a chain reaction that gives that perception increasing plausibility through its rising availability in public discourse. So how does this work? Well, the media reports of an event. Somewhere, something has happened, and now that is in the news because it might be part of a phenomena. Now there are multiple stories out there because somebody has reported on this. This creates emotional reaction of upset people. The emotional reaction is now a news story. Professional, political, and academics are in the relevant fields anywhere tied to this try to soothe fears. They are accused of a cover-up. Others are brought forward with news of how this could be problematic. They make the news more so. Conspiracy stories about the news events are now in the news. And then we're talking about the news of the news. And there's this cascading of events where we're always talking about this one idea. And the more we talk about this one idea, the more likely we are to be able to recall that idea. And according to availability bias, the more likely we're able to recall something, the more probabilistic or higher probability we associate with it actually being likely. There is this systematic bias. Often there's a call to do something about the alarming problem with the way that the world is currently working. Thus, we get fads of policies. It's much harder to get rid of policies than to actually get them, so this could be kind of problematic. Thus, availability bias is an important concept within behavioral political economy.